It was 4 in the morning. The date was March 30th, 1867. Two men sat across from each other in a Washington office, surrounded by clerks who had been pulled from their beds in the middle of the night, and they signed a document that would quietly reshape the entire balance of power in the Pacific for the next 150 years. One of those men, the American, had been knifed in the face less than 2 years earlier, the same night Abraham Lincoln was shot, and he had come back from it with a jaw wired shut and an obsession that his critics called lunacy. The other man had traveled from St. Petersburg, carrying a secret that his own government was barely willing to admit out loud, that the mighty Russian Empire was afraid, not of America, of Britain. And what they signed that morning, for the price of about 2 cents an acre, was one of the brilliant and misunderstood geopolitical moves in the history of this country. Your history teacher probably told you America bought Alaska because Seward thought it was a good idea, and some people called it a folly, and then gold was discovered and everyone felt better. That's not the story. The real story is about a global chess match between empires, a man who nearly died and refused to stop, a territory whose people were never consulted, and a piece of land that has saved this country more than once since. Let me take you back to a world where America was still bleeding from its civil war, Russia was licking its wounds from a catastrophic defeat in Crimea, and Britain was the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. I was digging through primary sources on American territorial expansion, documents from the State Department archives, essays from the Library of Congress's Meeting of Frontiers collection, and I kept running into the same problem. Everything I had been taught about the Alaska Purchase was technically correct, but completely missing the point. Yes, Seward bought it. Yes, people mocked him. Yes, gold showed up and vindicated him. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that the real story had almost nothing to do with Alaska itself, and everything to do with one of the most intense geopolitical rivalries of the 19th century, and where America chose to position itself inside that rivalry. So let me break this down for you, because this story deserves to be told properly.
To understand why the United States bought Alaska in 1867, you have to understand why Russia was desperately trying to sell it. And to understand that, you have to go back to a war that most Americans have never thought much about, the Crimean War. Between 1853 and 1856, Russia fought a coalition that included Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The Russians lost, and they lost badly. It was a humiliation that reshaped how Tsar Alexander II thought about his empire's vulnerabilities. And one of those vulnerabilities, a massive, frozen, impossibly remote one, was Alaska. Here is what almost nobody tells you in school. During the Crimean War, British and French naval forces didn't just fight in Crimea, they showed up in the Pacific. A combined Anglo-French squadron assembled in Honolulu and sailed into the North Pacific looking for Russian ships. They besieged the Russian port of Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. The message was unmistakable. Britain's reach extended everywhere. And Alaska, which shared the same ocean, had almost no military defense. According to the Library of Congress, the Tsar's government drew an obvious conclusion. In any future war with Britain, Alaska could simply be seized, and Russia would get nothing for it. Zero. So if you're the Tsar, you do the math. You can lose Alaska for free in the next war, or you can sell it now to someone who isn't your enemy and at least walk away with something. That brings us to the bigger picture that historians call the Great Game. From roughly the 1820s onward, Russia and Britain were locked in an escalating competition for influence across Central Asia, the Pacific, and the Arctic. Every move one empire made was watched and countered by the other. Alaska sat right at the intersection of this rivalry. It was Russian territory, but it was surrounded. To the south, Britain controlled what would become Canada, including its Pacific coastline. The Hudson Bay Company, a British commercial empire in everything but name, had actually been leasing part of southern Alaska from Russia, which tells you something about how much real control Russia had over the territory. According to records documented by the State Department's Office of the Historian, Russia's calculation was that selling Alaska to the United States would accomplish something brilliant. It would use American territory as a geographic wedge between British Canada in the Pacific Ocean. If America owned Alaska, then Britain's North American possessions would be flanked. The United States, whether it fully realized it or not, was being recruited as a strategic buffer. Russia wasn't just selling a chunk of land, it was reshaping the map of North American power in a way that would disadvantage its most dangerous rival for generations.
Now here's the part that gets me every time I think about it, because it tells you something important about the diplomatic world of the 1860s. Russia and the United States were, at this moment in history, genuinely friendly toward each other. They shared a common adversary in Britain, and that shared adversary had created a real bond. During the American Civil War, Britain had remained officially neutral while continuing to trade with the Confederacy, which infuriated the Union. Russia, by contrast, had sent its naval fleet to visit American ports in 1863, a gesture that Americans at the time interpreted as a show of solidarity. As the Library of Congress documents it, in the mid-19th century, Russia and the United States were drawn together by a mutual hostility toward Great Britain and a general alignment on most foreign policy matters. Of all the major European powers during the Civil War, Russia was the only one that clearly supported the Union. So when the Tsar decided he needed to offload Alaska, he wasn't going to offer it to Britain. That would be handing his enemy exactly the kind of Pacific foothold that terrified him. He was going to offer it to America, and he needed someone on the American side who was ready to say yes. That man was William Henry Seward. And here is where this story gets personal, because Seward was not some paper-pushing bureaucrat who stumbled into history. He was an obsessive, visionary, infuriating, sometimes reckless Secretary of State who had been dreaming about American expansion into the Pacific for most of his career. Seward served under both Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, and his worldview was simple. America's future was in Asia. The Pacific was going to be the great commercial theater of the coming century, and Alaska, with its enormous coastline, its proximity to the trade routes, its position between Russia and the rest of North America, was, in his eyes, the key to that future. He had been quietly signaling his interest in Alaska for years before the deal materialized. According to the National Archives, as early as 1864, he had told the Russian government that talks about Alaska would be beneficial to both sides. He was ready. He had been ready for a long time. The night of March 29, 1867, Russian minister to the United States, Edouard de Stokel, came to Seward with news. St. Petersburg had authorized him to finalize the sale. Seward's response tells you everything you need to know about the man. Stokel suggested they conclude the deal the following day. Seward said no. Let's do it tonight. He summoned his clerks, sent word to Stokel's team, and they worked through the night. At 4 o'clock in the morning on March 30th, 1867, the treaty was signed. The price, $7.2 million. For 586,000 square miles of land. That works out, as the National Archives records confirm, to roughly 2 cents an acre, for a territory twice the size of Texas, for what would eventually prove to be one of the most resource-rich pieces of land on the planet. But here is the context that most school textbooks quietly leave out. Alaska already had people in it. Tens of thousands of them. The Tlingit, the Aleut, the Yupik, the Inupiat, the Athabascan, the Haida, nations with their own governments, their own territories, their own history stretching back thousands of years before any Russian or American had ever set foot on that coastline. Neither Russia nor the United States consulted a single one of them.
According to records documented by scholars at the Arctic Institute and the University of Alaska, the Tlingit people of Southeast Alaska were particularly vocal about what they considered a profound injustice. They had never surrendered their land, they had never signed a treaty with Russia, and they were furious that two foreign governments had traded their homeland over an all-night negotiation session in Washington. The U.S. Army commander in Alaska at the time purportedly acknowledged that many Tlingit leaders would frequently take occasion to express their dislike at not having been consulted about the transfer. That frustration was real, and it was legitimate, and it would take more than a century until the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 before the United States would begin to seriously address the land rights of the people who had been there all along. That's a piece of this story that belongs in the telling, because great achievements and historical wrongs can exist in the same moment, and acknowledging one doesn't diminish the other. Back in Washington, the treaty faced a serious fight. The Senate had to ratify it, and a lot of senators were not convinced. The press was openly mocking the deal. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune was particularly savage. The territory was variously called Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and in perhaps my favorite piece of 19th century editorial rage, Wall Russia. Critics asked what possible use America had for a frozen, inaccessible wasteland full of glaciers and polar bears. This is the version of the story most people know, the part where everyone laughed and then turned out to be wrong. But here's what that version leaves out. The treaty almost didn't make it through Congress, and the man who saved it wasn't Seward at all.
His name was Charles Sumner, and he was the Republican senator from Massachusetts who chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. When the treaty arrived in the Senate, Sumner maneuvered it into his committee for investigation rather than letting it go to an immediate vote. He then did something remarkable. He studied. According to the U.S. Senate Historical Office, Sumner buried himself in maps, journals, atlases, pamphlets, newspapers, manuscripts, and more than 100 books in English, German, French, and Russian on the subject of this territory that almost no American had ever thought about. He transformed himself, as historians have written, from a skeptic into a powerful persuader. On April 8, 1867, he delivered a 3-hour speech to the Senate that laid out the geographic, commercial, and strategic case for Alaska in exhaustive detail. The Senate voted 37-2 in favor of ratification. Without Sumner, it is genuinely possible that Seward's greatest achievement would have died in committee. Without Sumner, there may be no state of Alaska. The formal transfer took place on October 18, 1867, in Sitka, which had been the capital of Russian America. Russian soldiers lowered their flag. American soldiers raised theirs. It was a brief ceremony, almost modest, given the scale of what had just changed. Most of the Russians who had lived there packed up and went home. And then America largely forgot about Alaska for the next 30 years. It sat there, vast and ignored, governed first by the Army, then by the Treasury Department, then by various military authorities, for a long stretch with almost no formal civilian government at all. Alaska was the strange, enormous acquisition that nobody quite knew what to do with. That changed in 1896, and the numbers don't lie about what happened next. Gold was discovered in the Klondike region, and within a year, the territory that newspapers had called a sucked orange was the most talked-about destination in America. The Great Klondike Gold Rush transformed the territory overnight, vindicating everything Seward had argued and proving every critic spectacularly wrong. But even that wasn't the end of Alaska's hidden value. In the years that followed, the territory revealed fisheries of extraordinary productivity, forests of immense commercial value, and oil reserves that would eventually make Alaska one of the most economically significant states in the Union.
And then came World War II, which showed the country something it had never fully considered. Alaska was a military necessity. In 1942, Japanese forces actually invaded and occupied American soil on the Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska, both part of Alaska, marking the only occupation of American territory during that war. The response was fierce, and the fight to retake those islands was brutal. But the deeper lesson was what Alaska made possible for the entire defense of the Pacific. Its position, spanning the top of the ocean, pointing toward Asia, straddling the routes between North America and the Russian Far East, made it irreplaceable. The construction of the Alaska Highway was accelerated as a direct result of the Japanese threat, connecting Alaska to the continental United States through Canada in a feat of engineering that is remarkable to this day. Alaska was no longer an afterthought. It was a frontier in the most strategic sense of the word. Then came the Cold War. Alaska's proximity to the Soviet Union made it a central piece of American continental defense, home to radar installations, early warning systems, and military infrastructure that sat at the very edge of the confrontation between the two superpowers. The territory that critics had called Seward's icebox had become, within a century of its purchase, one of the most strategically important pieces of American real estate in the world. Alaska became the 49th state on January 3, 1959. And in the decades since, the discovery and development of massive oil reserves connected to the continental pipeline system in the 1970s has generated hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth and established Alaska as a cornerstone of American energy production. What began as a diplomatic chess move in a global rivalry between Russia and Britain turned out to be, by any measure, one of the greatest land deals in the history of American statecraft. Most people can walk you through the simple version of this story. Seward bought it, people laughed, gold proved them wrong, the end. But the story that actually happened is richer and stranger and more important than that. It's a story about a man who refused to let an assassination attempt slow him down. It's a story about an empire humiliated in war, calculating how to turn its losses into leverage. It's a story about the invisible third power in every negotiation, Britain looming over everything, forcing Russia and America toward each other. It's a story about a senator from Massachusetts who read 100 books in 4 languages because he thought the truth deserved a proper defense. And it's a story that includes a chapter we can't skip, the tens of thousands of people who already lived in Alaska, who had built civilizations in that landscape over thousands of years, and who watched 2 foreign governments decide their future without asking a single one of them. That complexity is part of what America is. We can hold the achievement and the injustice in the same hand and still take the measure of both honestly. That's not weakness. That's the kind of reckoning that makes a country actually understand itself. And here's the part of this that I think matters today. Seward was not acting on certainty. He didn't know about the gold. He couldn't see the oil. He had no way of predicting that Japanese planes would one day fly over American soil on those Aleutian Islands, or that radar installations in Alaska would become a front line in the Cold War. He was acting on vision. He looked at the map and saw something that almost nobody else could see. A foothold in the Pacific, a wedge against British power, a gateway to the commercial future of America. He signed the treaty at 4 in the morning because he didn't want to wait one more day. In that impulse to act boldly on a vision that the critics haven't caught up to yet turns out to have been exactly right. Not because it was perfect, not because it was just to every person it affected, but because the people who shape history are almost never the ones waiting for consensus. They're the ones who see the board differently and move. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the Crimean War connection, the all-night negotiation, the role of Charles Sumner, or something else? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and some of the best follow-up videos I've ever made came directly from comments on this channel. If this story made you see Alaska differently, or made you think about American history differently, Share it with someone who loves this country enough to want to know the real version of it. Next time, we're going into a story that connects directly to this one, the forgotten American who almost single-handedly mapped the resources of Alaska decades before anyone in Washington took it seriously, and whose work sat in a government archive for years before anyone understood what it meant. You do not want to miss that one. If you're not subscribed, hit that button. And if you enjoyed this video, the like button is right there. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.